according to the abstract on our schedule, we told the committee when we the panel when we invited them that this would be a moderated discussion on the issues and opportunities for research libraries. Over lunch, we told them that they have 45 minutes to solve all of our problems. So no pressure to any of them, but let me just introduce them quickly all in turn. I wanted to bring together those who are practitioners in the collection development, collection strategy, and in particular with a global focus. Two of our panelists today are part of CRL's Collections and Services Policy Committee. Two of them are leaders at their institutions for global studies or area studies programs. So we thought that this was an appropriate mix to help address the global supply chain. In alphabetical order of last name, Jeff Kosokoff on our far side is the head of collection strategy and development at Duke University Libraries. Pamela Graham, who's second to, well, my right, second to your left, is the director of the Humanities and Global Studies, as well as the director of the Center for Human Rights Documentation and Research at Columbia University Libraries. Sarah Sussman, who's third next to Jeff, is the curator for French and Italian collections and the head of the Humanities and Area Studies Resource Group at Stanford University Libraries. And Caitlin Tillman, immediately to my left, is the Associate Chief Librarian for Collections and Materials Management at the University of Toronto Libraries. We've asked them to start off a conversation amongst themselves and amongst us in the room about some of the reflections they've heard today, some of the challenges they might want to pick up on further conversation, or just general opportunities as they saw fit. And Caitlin has volunteered to go first on our list.
Hello, is this on? Yeah. So in thinking about what I was going to say, we really mostly concentrated on what Clifford Lynch said this morning about rethinking and how we needed to rethink what we're going to do. And I wanted to highlight, in terms of rethinking, what we heard a lot about from Melissa, but something that has been touched on, and there's threads of this throughout the 2 days. And I think also a little plug for Canada, since we weren't mentioned so much in the past 2 days, so I'm going to do it now. Something that for my Canadian colleagues and I is probably a little present right now because of something that actually Irina alluded to in her presentation, and that is that Canada had what South Africa had, which is a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which released a report in 2015. And that report documented the history and impacts of the Indian residential school programs in Canada. And it made 94 calls to action. And these proposed actions called on all levels of the government, and in Canada, of course, cultural institutions are government funded, to work together to repair the harm caused by the residential schools and begin the process of reconciliation in Canada. Educational institutions and memory institutions figure very prominently in these 94 calls to action. I should also mention that this documentation, a lot of the documentation that was done was interviews with survivors of the residential schools. So that is a big part of the history. So what I would maybe really like to distill from what has been said is, I think, I guess the environment or the sort of the thinking that we're operating under now at cultural institutions in Canada, and that is the knowledge that we're not always the good guys. We're not always doing what is right and what is good, and we tend to think that we are, and certainly until we began talking about these calls to actions, it hadn't occurred to me to sit back and think it's not for me to say, but for others to say. So, it was that sort of put a layer on everything, or a perspective over everything that I heard, and And so I guess what I really want to say is that there's a technological future, yes, that we have to deal with, but there's also a cultural future. And I think when we're doing our rethinking, we really have to pay attention to both. And just to mention a couple of things that I found a little alarming. So when Ginny was talking about, what was it, the Africomics from South Africa? So I was thinking, okay, so while in Canada we're working with our local communities to do, as Melissa described, have them take the lead in the metadata creation and all of the things that come with their materials. And I'm saying this with the full knowledge that most of the Canadian federal government documents in Hathi Trust are from the University of Michigan. That you may all here get yourself an Arcadia grant and digitize and create metadata for this same cultural heritage that we're now asking our communities to create. So these will be two very different, I think, products that we would create, and one that would come from our traditional way of looking at archiving and metadata, and the other that will come from what will hopefully be a new way, a way that's probably closer to what Melissa has described in Canada. So that's one of the things I wanted to say, just to make sure that we consider the cultural changes that we should incorporate in our rethinking. And then the other thing I was thinking about was to do as David suggested, he said, let's not fight yesterday's battles, but so to link Clifford in there, I think that what he alluded to in rethinking is when we're not fighting yesterday's battles, let's also not do it with yesterday's perspectives. So let's have new thoughts about what we're doing. So what could these new thoughts be? And one of the things I was thinking was, so compromise is often seen as something fairly negative, and maybe we should think about it as being positive. So maybe compromise is something that we can do that actually helps us move forward. The other thing I was thinking about was Sarah mentioning neighborly goods. So we see it also in Irina's talk about these big conglomerates and them buying up related companies and doing related research. So I thought maybe we should think about what are our neighborly goods? How can we use it, if Monsanto can partner with John Deere, shouldn't we find our John Deere? Like who can we work with there? And then the other thing I thought was interesting, and maybe this requires a little bit of a rethink too, is a lot of what we saw here today is not just the global supply chain that supplies us with materials, but also how do we supply the global supply chain? So how do we get the stuff that we're producing out to everybody else? So those are my thoughts.
Actually, that's a nice shift to what I was thinking over the past few days and listening to all these wonderful presentations. One of the things, the main thing that I want to talk about that I noticed that sort of went through the 2 days has been the relationship between the libraries and the archives and the scholars that use them, and the ways that the materials are changing, and maybe that will change, will influence and change some of the relationship between the scholars and the libraries and librarians. And it was really nice to hear scholars talk about how they use their materials, how they interact, the questions that they pose, and how they are also involved in creating data and creating materials. And this is something I think that more dialogues can emerge from. So what is the role of faculty and scholars in the knowledge supply chain? How they can help libraries procure and generate data and other types of information that might be non-commercial, that might be unattainable in other ways. How sort of the tension between this type of content that, that scholars generate, and the proprietary data that we've been talking about over the past few days, and the problems that poses to libraries and to academic research. One of the sort of related topics that came up also, I think, in this morning's, in Clifford's talk this morning, was the difference in sort of the shift from knowledge to information, from analysis, away from analysis to data, and this sort of focus on what libraries it seems that they might be concentrating on or shifting to, and how does this change our relationships with scholars? How do the materials available now change the questions that are asked by the scholars that we're working with? And how does it change the methodologies that they use and that we need to be prepared for as well? So how do we and how do libraries interact with these research materials, and what do we need to know about the sources, the data, where it's coming from? What tools do we need to deal with large amounts of data whose full contents may not be known? The web archives is one example of this. The agriculture data is another. So there's all this huge amounts of data, and we don't necessarily have the tools or perhaps the expertise, and libraries, librarians, and scholars might need to reach out to other types of expertise. So another thing that came up this morning with this big data is the need also for us, for librarians, to shift out to, well, is the shift from collecting and preserving the past to collecting and stewarding the present, and how we do that. And sort of new interactions, new types of relationships that we can make with content creators, documentary filmmakers, journalists, sociologists, anthropologists. So trying to tighten and change those relationships, because I think that might be the source of a lot of the information that we're bringing in from now on. So those are some of the main issues. The other thing that came up, and this also affects our relationship with scholars, but it really affects our relationship with vendors, is that how we are often in competition with vendors for the content, for the sources, and in some ways the vendors are taking on some of our traditional roles, both in creating and trying and preserving the content, but also in organization of the content, but also even in an outreach role in providing sort of like SAGE methodologies, sort of providing the tools that can bypass some of librarians' traditional roles and create their own relationships with scholars and even with students. So these are some of the things that I thought were very interesting. But those are, I think in terms of CRL, going towards the future, it might be interesting to increase, to think about how the members reach out to scholars and take advantage of their expertise and of their connections with primary sources. So that's what I wanted to add.
I guess I'll go next, and I think a lot of what I've heard has resonated with me, and many of the things I was thinking about and picking up as I heard the presentations and looked through some of the readings for the different sessions. One of my kind of maybe boldest questions is whether the sort of metaphor of the supply chain is the right one to be characterizing and helping us think about the issues. There's a certain amount of fixity and linearity that I associate with supply chain, of moving specific fixed things through time and space to some endpoint. And it's clear that the work of the kind of collecting that's going on, whether that be conversion to digital, whether that be stabilizing the already or born digital, or working with artifacts, is really about networks of all kinds, and that there isn't often a lot of linearity in this process, as we start to see a blurring of who is the producer of information, whose role is it to collect? Are we generating new information as well as collecting? There's a lot of fluidity, I think, in working, especially with Born Digital. And so I really liked Cliff's ideas about roles, and how roles may be shifting as we think about the tremendous challenge of custodianship in the digital era. I think that's happening across the board, not just for librarians, but I would challenge programmers and others in this space to be thinking about their roles, and where ethics and other kinds of issues may come into play in those professions, as well as with librarians. So I think that's been a really interesting and, for me, exciting part of working. Most of the Born Digital work I've done has been working with web archives, and that's just a small piece of the Born Digital landscape, but it's been really interesting to think about. As I collect, it feels sometimes very much like what I've done in the past, but I'm also very conscious that I'm sort of creating a data set, and that's going to have a different kind of use among end users. And I feel there is more accountability asked of me than ever to explain the choices that are getting made about what we're selecting, what we're not, what we're getting because we can get it technically, and what things we can't get simply because the technology doesn't allow us to. And if we are seeing sort of more analytical uses of these digital collections, the users have to know a lot of this information, so they will be in a position to make claims and to be able to know if the collections are representative of some area or topic or event. So I feel we're really challenged to rethink our roles and what's required of us. And that's where I would advocate really not adopting frameworks we might be comfortable with from the world of digitization or conversion of content when it comes to Born Digital, to really rethink the frames and the ways that we approach doing this. In some ways, archival practice can be very helpful, but in some ways, it doesn't connect, in my opinion, to the kind of work we're doing, and some of these assumptions within that aren't translating, in my opinion, into the world of Born Digital work. There was one reading that was shared by James, by Justin Grimmer, We Are All Social Scientists Now, who makes the point with big data that it's not only about the computational aspect or the computer science aspect, but you still have to know at the end of the day, you have to work as any social scientist would in trying to understand how you can make causal claims, how you can pull out of that big data different ways of sampling or understanding what's there. And you can't treat it only as a purely computational problem, but it has to be rooted in a lot of the skills and ways that social scientists are trained to think about the challenge of how you can try to explain things when you know you have an imperfect world, and the inability to know completely what your universe is and all those kinds of things. I would say there's a parallel thing going on in librarianship where the digital collecting is not just about the technology or the challenge of digital preservation, but it's about the challenge of curation and understanding how we translate ourselves into this environment to make choices and to scope and to shape what we're doing. And that's partly in the article I wrote with Kent Norsworthy, our argument that there's really a cultural issue here about libraries looking at themselves differently, to position themselves and to ensure we create the right kinds of roles and the right kind of support for people who want to work in this space, and that we're not working too much off of existing models and roles if those actually may not serve us so well in the future. So I think I'll stop there and hand things over to Joe.
Yeah, so every time I come to one of these, which are great, I feel like I've been on a really weird roller coaster. And I've been terrified of the last couple days, and I've been delighted. And I think one of the terrifying things we heard about is something we all know about is this idea of consolidation. And something we used to call a mashup back in the day. And now they're mashing together and staying together, so I don't think mashup's the right word anymore. But again, we heard about what the data companies are doing or what's happening with the geospatial information and I think even more frightening dark web sort of implications of what Cliff was talking about. I think we face consolidation and we face licensing as a really key challenge, and yet I learned today that Tetra Paks pay for what we're doing. That's a licensed technology, right? We don't like the licenses we have to sign, but we sure want people to keep signing that license. And I think what that points to for me is we have to pick the fights we're going to fight. I think you were saying that, Caitlin. I think there's things we have to do, there's practices we have to change, and I think maybe you all know the book Inside, Outside, Upside Down. I think, and there's this outside in, inside out thing going on. I think we're right to think that library practice has changed to be inside out, but it's actually outside, inside out. That we have to go get things in ways we never thought. I didn't learn about this in library school. That I'd be wanting to send more people to more countries to do more things, to find the stuff. When somebody finds something in a basement, I like the idea of a strike team in Latin America that's going around constantly looking for stuff, right? So what I was reminded of is CRL, and things like CRL are force multipliers. And this came up in the business meeting yesterday. It may not be big enough to do what it needs to do. I face pressures, I'm sure all of you do, to come up with a justification once in a while to pay your dues for this and other organizations. And I'm of the opinion we're actually not spending enough, and we're not giving enough resource to I don't want to call it the cloud, but to the community. And the things that need doing, we can't do by ourselves. And that's why CRL came into existence in the first place, was to guarantee persistence for things that would not otherwise have been necessarily kept persistent. So that's one thing I thought of. The other thing I thought of is I think CRL is trying to make a move to post-custodial, although you haven't called it that, Bernie. If we are going to stop collecting physical objects to fulfill CRL's mission, but are instead going to ensure their preservation elsewhere and get digital copies, that sounds a whole like what you're talking about to me. And so maybe I think the archival world can teach the general collections world a lot, and we haven't paid enough attention probably as a community to archival practice and how those practices can help us out. So maybe that's something we can talk about more going forward. I had one more. Oh yeah, I want to say too, I think CRL has a really important role in the past with setting guidelines and standards. I think it's a nice place for CRL to sit. Track certification is like that. I think we've been talking in NERL about could NERL provide more of a template, at least, for evaluating open access resources that were licensed resources. I think there's some interesting opportunities, again, since those are things that need to be done kind of once and maintained. They're not collecting things. It's like a little project. We have enough people in the room, the critical mass. I think about the people we get to come to. A lot of you I've seen at this meeting for the last 4 years. There's enough of us here to do some of that work so that nobody else has to, and they could rely on it. So I think, again, CRL as a force multiplier is a really important thing to remember. And when Bernie wants to raise the dues to 1%, he has my support. I don't know if everybody else's, but.
Revolutions often start with just one idea. So everybody get out your checkbooks now. I think that was a great first pass, and I think we may want to delve into some of those concepts a little bit more here. We have about 10 minutes, but I want your comments to some questions that we might ask of ourselves. Really in the end, what we want to take out of this at the end of the day to get people excited to go out to O'Hare is really what can we take away? What do we do? And we is conceptually, all of us in this room, all of us as a consortium of like-minded institutions, we as a physical staff and body here in Chicago, what can we do about some of these things? Where do we take this on? And I agree with you, Pamela, that the supply chain may be too literal a concept here, but certainly in its in its basic definition of kind of a sequence of processes that make sure that material that's produced has gotten to the hands of the consumers. It's an important question to consider. And I've been at CRL for nearly 20 years, and I've never done the same kind of work twice. Judy and I constantly are having to make up new things to meet new demands and special circumstances. Every single project's a special circumstance, unfortunately. So yeah, there's not a lot of fixity in what we do. But what's the appropriate role for CRL to be that force multiplier? Are we ones that are, in the supply chain management? Are we the integration among the various bodies that are doing this work? Do we help communicate among those parties, be it Columbia's web archive and Texas's web archive, to make sure that all of the pieces are communicating with each other? That's what supply chain management is. Or are we the operational side? Do we do the day-to-day specifics of things? Judy gets her hands dirty on newspaper every day, so, is that a more appropriate role that we should put more of our chips into? Are we the purchasers in the supply chain? Are we creating relationships among these suppliers, providing the funding for these sort of things and aggregating those? Or, perhaps the distribution mechanism ultimately is kind of the question here is, how do we coordinate the logistics of all of that communication or the delivery of the material that's ephemeral and out there at this point? What's the appropriate role? And I welcome your thoughts on where you think we're best positioned or should be positioned better, or take it out to the group, for those thoughts or other questions.
So I would just say I think we shouldn't try to do everything.
Yeah.
I think that there's a tendency to think, well, CRL will do that, or you name another organization. I think we really need to think hard about what CRL is, somebody said yesterday, uniquely positioned to do best for us. I hate to think that, well, nobody else will do it, so CRL should. I think we shouldn't approach it that way.
I mean, I would kind of echo some of the things that Melissa was saying at the beginning about the kind of historical strengths of CRL and being able to bring together communities in different areas. And I think that's an enduringly important task that I would hope to continue seeing CRL as a supporter and facilitator of that. And I think there's a lot there that could be leveraged to helping us with new forms of collecting or new ways of thinking about collecting. So I would really endorse that function as of having lasting importance.
Do you all have comments or questions you want to throw out to the audience, or vice versa, for further thinking? I did see Ruby in the back.
Oh, thank you very much. So one thought that I have is regarding this question of ethics, question of what is the right thing to do, what is the right approach when you're looking at cultural heritage information, in creating partnerships with the communities that own that information, and so on. So we have talked at this forum about, say, for instance, the UT Austin situation where they have these human rights archives, and there are other institutions in the same sort of situation, but they are all grappling with how much information to make public regarding individuals, because people can be endangered. There was a question of that Derek posed earlier about people in southern Ethiopia in communities where there may be conflicts, and how much information do you want to give out about people and their personal lives and so on. And I know that in camp we have most recently dealt with the question of government information that's preserved through our partnership with archives in I believe this was the National Archives of Uganda. Some of that information is personnel information. And, you know, how do you draw up guidelines about sharing that information? And in that case, we had to look at what would have happened had those files been US government files. What would we do? So I'm thinking that there's a lot of work that has to be done here to catch up with the technology so that we don't jump ahead with providing information before we pull back to say, oh, look at the impact that was unintended. And I think that CRL could help a great deal in this regard. We have all of these sub-organizations under CRL umbrella, and they bring their own experiences to the forum. In addition to that, the membership itself of CRL, you know, the people in this room alone, with their partnerships and their experience at their, in their own careers and at their institutions, have a lot of knowledge, and they also have human resources on their campuses that can contribute to that standardization. So I'm wondering if CRL wouldn't be the place to create this sort of guidance for the community of libraries in this emerging way of doing things. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruby. Daniel in the back, and then Jim Nye up front.
So I like that concept of CRL being a force multiplier, but then it's coupled with what the focus is. And so I think for me, coming out of this meeting is, what's the communication, or what's the, and within the communication, what's the framework for an ongoing conversation? And, you know, I appreciate, Bernie, you've been doing blog posts, but how do we take this the next step to think about what are the things we really should be focusing on, and how can we as a membership get behind that? Because I think to really be for CRL to really be a force multiplier, we need a critical mass of the membership to say, yes, this thing or these particular initiatives are what we're going to put our weight behind. And if we need to find more funding for that, then let's have that conversation. But what are those key things going forward?
I think that's a great comment, Daniel. And one of the things that we are looking forward to rolling out in some ways that helps address your question is a platform that we've been working on ways that we can, as Bernie calls it, democratize some of our choices for things like digital projects, you know, where we can bring ideas to the table, have people comment on them, scope them into larger projects, and vote or prioritize collections. Something like that, you know, is great. And those don't have to be projects necessarily done in-house, you know, but under the CRL banner could be things that we could do. It's just one idea that just popped in my mind, but I think it's a really important question. We don't have a platform for that, Liz.
It's called a gallows.
Modulating the understanding of stewardship has been on my mind since this morning when that idea was first introduced by Clifford Lynch, and his suggestion that stewardship in a new mode really does necessitate the involvement of ethnographers, videographers, and a variety of people of different disciplines. With that as maybe a given, at least for me, and returning to Caitlin, your question, who is our John Deere? It seems maybe ironic that the faculty are our John Deere. I mean, they are the green giants, the Poppin' Johns, so to speak, of our academic institutions. But I'm not thinking of engagement of the faculty in the way that they have been to date, but thinking about them under leadership, I would suggest, by libraries at our home institutions as well as by CRL and national bodies as contributors into the framing of a set of questions that need to be addressed, and then helping us think through ways in which that can most productively be undertaken. Unless we continue to serve, I would say, both as stewards and leaders of stewardship, and also stimulate these discussions in ways that have already been done productively today, we won't have been meeting our obligations as academic librarians.
James, could I just?
Yeah, please, Jeff.
So I would actually, I think that's great, and I think we need to think of the faculty. Maybe this is what you mean, maybe going a little farther. I think they're subject matter experts to actually help us with the work. Yeah. So we're doing data work without our data scientists. We're doing sociological work and anthropological work without our anthropologists and sociologists in many of our institutions. There's tons of expertise. I think graduate students are an amazing resource for this. Some of the ways I'm trying to think about funding that by hiring them to help us with what they already know. I don't need them as scholars. I need them as experts. And I think there's a real, they can serve us. I think that's and maybe you're right, they are our John Deere, maybe.
Yeah. So I just have time for one more comment. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think one of the things I'm really hearing throughout this whole thing is really rethinking the roles, like some of the really essential big picture roles that we've taken for granted in the past. And I think rethinking sort of producer and product and researchers and researched is a pretty important thing as we look at our roles in access and collections and what we're providing. And I want to go back to Pamela's comment about rethinking archival assumptions for the new work we have to do. I wondered if there was anything actually specific that you were thinking of in that comment.
Yeah, I'll be very brief, but that comes up when we do we actually say web collecting at Columbia. We don't always say web archiving, to just look at it as another form of collecting that's more akin to how we build general collections, where we don't have the same kind of approach like an appraisal, where you may have a fixed body of material through which you have to work your way and decide what to keep, what not to keep, and then how to organize it. But we just have this constant unknown universe out there, and that to me feels more like what I face when I do general collecting than when I might sit and look at 50 boxes and try to figure out how to make sense of it. And so I think that sometimes those concepts of appraisal aren't translating to me, and that I feel like I get better guidance from thinking about the ways we scope general collections and whether we could move that into the digital realm and use that as a basis for understanding how we scope and shape what we should be collecting.
Please join me in thanking our esteemed panel, and thank you so much for your thoughts.